Hello, BookTube, from both of us. And welcome back to our buddy read of Mr. Scarborough's Family by Anthony Trollope, which I've been just dutifully reading here, but I want to make a point of saying how much I've been enjoying this. And not just the reading to you, which I love doing. Turns out I love reading to you, so we're going to keep doing that. Uh, and suggestions are welcome. I meant to say that the last few times that I mentioned how much I enjoy this, is that suggestions are welcome. Just remember that the book has to be in the common domain. I'm not going to deal with copyright issues, which means that if you want me to read you a work in translation into English, the translation has to be in the copyright domain. It's not just a question of the original work, unless I were to do the translation myself. But I meant to mention, in addition to how much I enjoy reading this, how much I enjoy the interactions that I'm having in emails and on Voxer and on the comment sections of these videos. I have mentioned the ongoing question in this read aloud. Is this just what it would be like to be in a book club or a buddy read with Steve, or is this like what it would be like to be in a class with Steve? I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that this is definitely how I taught books when I taught them. There was no rigid caustic hierarchy at all. There was no authority. There were some very basic things. If you're here to disrupt the class, if you're just here to do that, you're just getting a little dopamine hit out of disrupting the class, then you can go. And if that's all of you, then we'll empty the room. And if you think that's going to get me in trouble with my superiors instead of you, you're wrong. So that's thing number one. And thing number two is, since this is a class, most of these classes are totally based on reading, except for the classes that were based on writing, but even those were based on reading. Since this is a class entirely based on reading, you have to do the reading. Can't fake it, can't lie about it, can't not do it and show up anyway. You can't do anything like that. No, this is serious stuff. This is for serious people. That's it. That's the extent of it. The place that where the measuring, where the academic style measuring is going to come in is not in whether or not we can put our knees together in a circle and talk about this book, because we're going to do that, and we're going to do that enthusiastically. And I'm going to learn as much as I teach. I know teachers say that all the time, but I've known so many teachers, especially teachers of literature in college, who could not be lying more when they say that. It's so patronizing when they do. I know some of them mean it, but I've known some that, most of the ones that I've heard that have said that sort of thing, are so patronizingly lying when they say, "Oh, I learn a lot from my students." No, for me, the yardstick, the actual academic yardstick, was going to come in, of course, in the writing, because eventually we're going to write about this book, and we would be deep in conversation in those classes. We would be reading sections out loud, or we would be talking about, well, what does this make sense? Is this an element of whatever book we're talking about that would actually be clarified by outside reading? Is it important to know that, Thucydides was an active military person? Is that important to know in this particular passage or whatnot? Eventually it would come down to writing. We're going to write about this book. And over the years, I had students say, "Well, but you're not like the other teachers in our other classes. You're not professing a line that we need to memorize. You're asking us for our opinions, and we're hashing over all this stuff together. How on earth are you going to make an exam out of any of this?" And it was very simple. My exam was very simple. Pick some subject connected with this book and write about it. Support what you say and write about it. You can't just appreciate it. You have to make a point about it. And you can't just parrot what I say or what anybody else has said in class. You have to write about it. You have to dig in and think about it. So in terms of this, but the reason it was on my mind today is because in terms of this book, I've had two people so far come pipe up to me in my emails in defense of a character that we're getting front and center today in this chapter, which is Mama Mountjoy, Mrs. Mountjoy, Florence Mountjoy's mother, who I have been characterizing from the beginning of the book as obdurately stupid. And the two people who have spoken up in her defense have said, "All right, well, she's not Mensa material, but can I defend her anyway?" You absolutely can. You absolutely can. I love it. Absolutely love it. And so in a case like that, in a class, if I taught a class on this book, I would have said, well, okay, you've developed this opinion that Mrs. Mountjoy actually, there is a defense to be made of her. Make it. Make your defense. Draw on the book, cite page numbers. It can't be in crayon. It has to be typed. Make a formal presentation and do a bit of good writing. By that point, we'd usually done some writing exercises earlier in the class, because if you're in an English class with any pretense of any kind to be tending towards an English degree, you have to know how to write about what you read. It's as simple as that. So many young people go into an English major in college, an undergraduate English major in college, merely because they love to read. Anyway, I just wanted to thank you all. I guess is what I'm trying to say, is that I wanted to thank you all. This has been so wonderful. Just to hash all this out with you. We've had so many subjects involved here. Haven't yet had anyone say that they like Augustus Scarborough. But I've had plenty of people say they don't like Mountjoy Scarborough and cite chapter and verse, which is all I want. There's no sacred way to read this. That's all I want. Cite chapter and verse. You might change my mind. Because I learned so much. I've had a number of people come forward. Oh my God, by far the most contested subject in my email has been Trollope and anti-Semitism. And a number of people who've wanted to write about that subject to me do have outside sources, have read other essays or condemnations of Trollope along those lines or whatnot. Very interesting, very interesting. As long as we all know how to talk to each other, and thankfully everyone who's emailing me about this book does, that we can poke fun at each other, but this is not a game of gotcha, and this is not a game of condescension. So as long as we know how to talk to each other, I'm preaching to the choir in this corner of BookTube, because we all do. I just wanted to thank you. That's all. This has been wonderful. And now we're going to visit with Mama Mountjoy, who is not happy, as you can imagine, from last chapter. Because in the last chapter, she went to a dance given by a friend of Harry Annesley, unknown to her, and she brought Florence, her daughter. And Harry showed up, bulled his way in past her mother, talked to Florence, and not only talked to Florence, but got a few squeezes of approbation from her. She didn't actually say anything except, "You are my hero," which is worth all the I love yous in the world as far as I'm concerned. That's a winner from Trollope. But she squeezed his arm at appropriate moments, and he felt like a hero and threw his hat up in the air. Because now they are affianced. And she also, we read her thoughts, that she would have thought this anyway, regardless of what Harry did. But her mother was sternly watching the whole time, and then takes her away in the carriage to go back home at midnight. And that's what this chapter is. Remember, in the last chapter, Mrs. Mountjoy, Mama Mountjoy, hints to Florence that she knows something about Harry Annesley that would throw his name into the utter depths of disrepute, and that Florence doesn't know it. There's only one thing that can be, and unbeknownst to her mother, Florence does know it. Let's see what goes on here. This is chapter 13, and it's called Mrs. Mountjoy's Anger. Florence, as she went home in the fly with her mother after the party at which Harry had spoken to her so openly, did not find the little journey very happy. Mrs. Mountjoy was a woman endowed with a strong power of wishing rather than of willing, of desiring rather than contriving, but she was one who could make herself very unpleasant when she was thwarted. Her daughter was now at last fully determined that if she ever married anybody, that person should be Harry Annesley. Having at once pressed his arm in token of assent, she had, as it were, given herself away to him, so that no reasoning, no expositions could, she thought, change her purpose. Little damning qualification there, could, she thought. Is she going to be tempted in Brussels? And she had much more power of bringing about her purpose design than had her mother. But her mother could be obstinate and self-willed, and would for the time make herself disagreeable. Florence had assured her lover that everything should be told to her mother that night before she went to bed, but Mrs. Mountjoy did not wait to be simply told. No sooner were they seated in the fly together than she began to make her inquiries. "What has that man been saying to you?" Florence was at once offended by hearing her lover so spoken of, and could not simply tell the story of Harry's successful courtship as she had intended. "Mamma," she said, "why do you speak of him like that?" "Because he is a scamp." "He is no scamp. It is very unkind of you to speak of such terms of one you know is very dear to me." "I do not know it. He ought not to be dear to you at all. You have been for years intended for another purpose." That is, for those of you who are catching us late, Captain Scarborough. She has been intended for Captain Scarborough, not by her own will at all. This was intolerable to Florence. This idea that she should have been considered as capable of being intended for the purposes of other people. and a resolution at once formed in her mind that she would let her mother know that such intentions were futile. But for the moment she sat silent. A journey home at 12 o'clock at night in a fly was not the time for expressions of her resolution. "I say he is a scamp," said Mrs. Mountjoy. "During all these enquiries there have been made after your cousin, he has known all about it." "Duh, duh, duh." "He has not known all about it," said Florence. "You contradict me in a very impertinent manner, and cannot be acquainted with the circumstances. The last person who saw your cousin in London was Mr. Harry Annesley, and yet he has not said a word about it, while search has been being made on all sides. And he saw him under circumstances most suspicious in their nature, so suspicious as to have made the police arrest him if they were aware of them. He had at that moment grossly ill-treated Captain Scarborough." "No, mamma, no, it was not so." "How do you know? How can you tell?" "I do know, and I can tell. The ill usage has come from the other side. This is the last thing Mrs. Mountjoy expects. Mamma Mountjoy is expecting that she is dropping a bombshell on Florence. The last thing she expects is that Florence already knows." "Then you, too, have known the secret, and have said nothing about it? You, too, have been aware of the violence which took place at that midnight meeting? You have been aware of what befell your cousin, the man to whom you were all but engaged, and you have held your tongue at the instigation, no doubt, of Harry Annesley? Oh, Florence, you also will find yourself in the hands of a policeman." At this moment the fly drew up at the door of the house in Montpelier Place, and the two ladies had to get out and walk up the steps into the hall, where they were congratulated on their early return from the party by the lady's maid. "Mamma, I will go to bed," said Florence as soon as she reached her mother's room. "I think you had better, my dear, though heaven knows what disturbances there may be during the night." By this Mrs. Mountjoy had intended to imply that Prodgers the policeman might probably not lose a moment before he was at once to proceed to arrest Miss Mountjoy for the steps she had taken in regard to the disappearance of Captain Scarborough. She had heard from Harry Annesley the fact that he had been brutally attacked by the captain in the middle of the night in the streets of London, and for this, in accordance with her mother's theory, she was to be dragged out of bed by a constable, and that probably before the next morning should have come. There was something in this so ludicrous as regarded the truth of the story, and yet so cruel as coming from her mother, that Florence had hardly knew whether to cry or laugh as she laid her head upon the pillow. But in the morning she was thinking that the facts of her own position had still to be explained to her mother, that it would be necessary that she should declare her purpose and impossibility of change now that she had once pledged herself to her lover. Mrs. Mountjoy came into her room and stood at the bedside with the appearance of ghostly displeasure, which always belongs to an angry old lady in a nightcap. "Well, mamma." "Florence, there must be an understanding between us." "I hope so. I had thought there always had been. I am sure, mamma, that you have known that I have never liked Captain Scarborough so as to become his wife. And I think you have known that I have liked Harry Annesley." "Liking are all fiddlesticks." "No, mamma, or if you object to the word, I will say love. You have known that I have not loved my cousin, and that I have loved this other man. That is not nonsense. That, at any rate, is a stern reality. If there be anything in the world that is real. Stern. You may well call it stern. I mean unbending, strong, not to be overcome by outside circumstances. If Mr. Annesley had not spoken to me as he did last night, could never have so spoken to me, I should have been a miserable girl, but my love for him would have been just as stern. I should have remained and thought of it, and have been very unhappy throughout my whole life. But he has spoken, and I am exultant. That, at any rate, I mean by stern. All that is most important, at any rate to me. I am here now to tell you that it is impossible." "Very well, mamma. Then things must go on, and we must bide our time." "Florence won't be a child under Mrs. Mountjoy's care forever." "The simple truth. Mrs. Mountjoy will not be able to tell her what to do in a few years." It is proper that I should tell you that he has disgraced himself." "Never. I will not admit it. You do not know the circumstances," exclaimed Florence. "It is most impertinent in you to pretend that you know them better than I do," said her mother indignantly. "The story was told to me by himself." "Yes, and therefore told untruly." "I grieve that you should think so of him, mamma, but I cannot help it. Where you have got your information from, I cannot tell. But I think we know, don't we? But that mine has been accurately told to me, I feel certain. At any rate, my duty is to look after you, and to keep you from harm. I can only do my duty to the best of my ability. Mr. Annesley is, my thinking, the most objectionable young man, and he will, I believe, be in the hands of the police before long. Evidence will have to be given in which your name, unfortunately, will be mentioned." "Why my name?" Florence keeps wondering about this, why she's going to come up. Of course she's going to come up. It is not probable that he will keep it secret when cross-questioned as to his having divulged the story to someone. He will declare that he has told it to you. When that time shall come, it will be well that we should be out of the country. I propose to start from here on this day week. So 1 week from today. That's Mrs. Mountjoy's idea of a quick getaway. Because we've got to get the furs together. Uncle Magnus will not be able to have us then. We must loiter away our time on the road. I look upon it as quite imperative that we shall both be out of England within 8 days of this time. But where will you go? Never mind. I do not know that I have as yet quite made up my mind, but you may understand that we shall start from Cheltenham this day week. Baker will go with us, and I shall leave the other 2 servants in charge of the house. I cannot tell you anything further as yet, except that I will never consent to your marriage to Mr. Harry Annesley. You had better know for certain that then there will be less cause for unhappiness between us. So saying, the angry ghost with the nightcap stalked out of the room. It need hardly be explained that Mrs. Mountjoy's information respecting the scene in London had come to her from Augustus Scarborough. When he told her that Annesley had been the last in London to see his brother Mountjoy, and had described the nature of the scene that had occurred between them, he had no doubt forgotten that he himself had subsequently seen his brother. In the story, as he told it, there was no need to mention himself, no necessity for such a character in making up the tragedy of that night. No doubt, according to his idea, the 2 had been alone together. Harry had struck the blow by which his brother had been injured, and had then left him in the street. Mountjoy had subsequently disappeared, and Harry had told no one that such an encounter had taken place. This had been the meaning of Augustus Scarborough when he informed his aunt that Harry had been the last who had seen Mountjoy before his disappearance. To Mrs. Mountjoy, the fact had been most injurious to Harry's character. Yes, you wonder how good a villain Augustus Scarborough is. Right? He's telling this story to her, and no doubt he would intimate this story to the police as well. But what's the thing that will blow it apart? Mountjoy Scarborough. Now, I know a number of you don't like Mountjoy Scarborough. You don't feel sorry for him at all. When Trollope, in last chapter, called him our friend, you said he was not my friend. I don't like him at all. Okay, but he wouldn't lie. He wouldn't just flat out lie. He would say that he went to his brother's place, that his brother saw him that night. Harry had willfully kept the secret while all the world was at work looking for Mountjoy Scarborough, and as far as Mrs. Mountjoy could understand, it might well be that Harry had struck the fatal blow that had sent her nephew to his long account. All the impossibilities in the case had not dawned upon her. It had not occurred to her that Mountjoy could not have been killed, and his body made away with without some great effort, in the performance of which the scamp could hardly have risked his life or character. But the scamp was certainly a scamp, even though he might not be a murderer, or he would have revealed the secret. And she would maybe think the same thing of Augustus Scarborough if she knew that he's been holding that secret, but she kind of wants Florence to marry one of these 2 brothers. In fact, Mrs. Mountjoy believed in the matter exactly what Augustus had intended, and so believing had resolved that her daughter should suffer any purgatory rather than become Harry's wife. Augustus telling her this, no doubt, to pave the way for his own marrying of Florence, which I don't think has even occurred to her at this point. But her daughter made her resolution exactly in the contrary direction. She in truth did not know what had been done that night, while her mother was in ignorance. She in truth did know what had happened that night, while her mother was in ignorance. The extent of her mother's ignorance she understood, but she did not at all know where her mother got her information. She felt that Harry's secret was in hands other than he had intended, and that someone must have spoken of the scene. It occurred to Florence at that moment that this must come from Mountjoy himself, whom she believed, and rightly believed, to have been the only second person present on the occasion. And if he had told it to anyone, then must that anyone know where and how he had disappeared? And the information must have been given to her mother solely with the view of damaging Harry's character and preventing Harry's marriage. Thinking all this, Florence felt that a premeditated and foul attempt, for as she turned it in her mind, the attempt seemed to be very foul, was being made to injure Harry. Hey, baby. What you doing? We're going to go through this? If you jump over there, you're going to realize that I'm not there, and you're going to want to come back here. We can do it. If you want to do that, we'll do that. Okay, there you are. But I'm not over there anymore. Anyway, let's see here. A false accusation was brought against him, and was grounded on a misinterpretation of the truth in such a manner as to subvert it altogether, to Harry's injury. It should have no effect upon her. To this determination she had come at once, and declared to herself solemnly that she would be true to it. An attempt was made to undermine him in her estimation, but they who made it had not known her character. She was sure of herself now, within her own bosom, that she was bound in a peculiar way to be more than ordinarily true to Harry Annesley. In such an emergency, she thought she ought to do for Harry more than a girl in common circumstances would be justified in doing for her lover. Harry was maligned, ill-used, and slandered. Her mother had been induced to call him a scamp, and to give as her reason for doing so an account of a transaction that was altogether false, though she no doubt had believed it to be true. As she thought of all this, she resolved that it was her duty to write to her lover and tell him the story as she heard of it. It might be most necessary that he should know the truth. She would write her letter and post it, so that it should be altogether beyond her mother's control, and then would tell her mother that she had written it. She at first thought that she would keep a copy of the letter and show it to her mother, but when it was written, those first words intended for a lover's eyes which had ever been produced by her pen, she found that she could not subject those very words to her mother's hard judgment. Her letter was as follows, and here we get a Trollope letter. Dear Harry, you will be much surprised at receiving a letter from me so soon after our meeting last night, but I warn you that you must not take it amiss. I should not write to you now, were it not that I think it may be for your interest that I should do so. I do not write to say a word about my love, of which I think you must be assured without any letter. I told Mamma last night what had occurred between us, and she, of course, was very angry. You will understand that, knowing how anxious she has been on behalf of my cousin Mountjoy. She has always taken his part, and I think it does Mamma great honor not to throw him over now that he is in the trouble. I should never have thrown him over in his trouble, had I ever cared for him in that way. I tell you that fairly, Master Harry. You remember last night she said, I consider you my master. But Mamma, in speaking against you, which she was bound to do in supporting poor Mountjoy, declared that you were the last person who had seen my cousin before his disappearance, and she knew there had been some violent struggle between you. Indeed, she knew all the truth as to that night, except that the attack had been made by Mountjoy on you. She turned the story all around, declaring that you had attacked him, which, as you perceive, gives a totally different appearance to the whole matter. Somebody had told her, though who it may be, I cannot guess. Can't you, though, Florence? You try hard. But somebody has been endeavoring to do you all the mischief he can in the matter, and has made Mamma think evil of you. She says that after attacking him and brutally ill-using him, you had left him in the street, and had subsequently denied all knowledge of having seen him. You will perceive that somebody has been at work inventing a story to do you a mischief, and I think it right that I should tell you. But you must never believe that I shall ever believe anything to your discredit. It would be to my discredit now. I know that you are good and true and noble, and that you would not do anything so foul as this. It is because I know this that I have loved you, and shall always love you. Let Mamma and others say what they will, you are now to me all the world. Oh, Harry, Harry, when I think of it, how serious it seems to me, and yet how joyful. I exult in you, and will do so, let them say what they may against you. You will be sure of that always. Will you not be sure of it? But you must not write a line in answer, not even to give me your assurance. That must come when we shall meet at length, say after a dozen years or so. I shall tell Mamma of this letter, which circumstances seem to demand, and shall assure her that you will write no answer to it. Oh, Harry, you will understand that all that I might say of my feelings in regard to you. Your own Florence. So notice, when Harry meets her at the dance, the previous night, she refers to him as Mr. Annesley. Now she doesn't. Now they're on a first-name basis because they're sworn to each other. This letter, when she had written it and copied it fair and posted the copy in the pillar box close by, she found that she could not in any way show absolutely to her mother. In spite of all her efforts, it had become a love letter, in spite of all, because she doesn't want it to be. She wants it to be just information. She views the writing of an explicit love letter as beneath her. That's already known. That was known in a gesture. Although, what happens to the copy? What happens to the original? If she sent the fair copy in the postbox, and notice Trollope mentions the postbox. Of course he does. He doesn't just say that she left it on the table and she mailed it without specifics, because he was so involved in the postal system. But what happens to the original copy? Does she keep it? Her mother could demand to see it. She can't refuse. And what genuine love letter can a girl show even to her mother? But she at once told her mother what she had done. Mamma, I have written a letter to Harry Annesley. You have? Yes, Mamma. I have thought it right to tell him what you heard about that night. And you have done this without my permission, without even telling me that you were going to? If I had asked you, you would have told me not. Of course I should have told you not. Good gracious, has it come to this? You correspond with a young gentleman without my leave, and when you know that I would not have given it? Mamma, in this instance it was necessary. Who was the judge of that? If he is to be my husband, he is not to be your husband. You are never to speak to him again. You shall never be allowed to meet him. You shall be taken abroad, and there you shall remain. He shall hear nothing about you. If he attempts to correspond with you, he will not. How do you know? I have told him not to write. Told him, indeed. Much he will mind such telling. I shall give your Uncle Magnus a full account of all of it, and ask for his advice. He is a man in high position, and perhaps you will think it fit to obey him, although you utterly refuse to be guided in any way by your mother. Then the conversation for the moment came to an end, but Florence, as she left her mother, assured herself that she could not promise any close obedience in any such matters to Sir Magnus. And here Trollope tells us that she assures herself of that she tells herself, I can't promise that I will obey Sir Magnus in anything. But I'd like to think of the scene in which she tells that to her mother, in which she says, well, I had no choice. It was necessary for me to do this behind your back, and I may find it necessary not to obey him either. But we're told that she tells it to herself, and here you have to think about Sir Magnus here for a minute. Think about what's coming his way. He doesn't know but the half of this, and it's all going to be dumped in his lap when all he wants is comfortable living and an afternoon free of his nagging wife. And a pretty young woman is coming into the orbit of his two young attendants, his two young attachés. But anyway, that is our chapter this time around. There is Mama Mountjoy in her full flower, and those of you who have written in defense of her have made a good case, which is she is not being tyrannical. She's being a little bit stupid. Once the heir apparent's father declares that he is illegitimate, his chances of inheriting the property are zero. Entails or no entails. But Mrs. Mountjoy doesn't want to let go of that. She thinks entails are sacred and unbreakable. That's a little bit dim or a little bit stubborn on her part. As we were told, she's more adept at wishing than willing. But she's going on authorities that she has known to be trustworthy her whole life. She says herself that I can only do what I see as best. She's trying to protect her daughter from an adventure. How many times have we seen that in other literature that we have read together? A parent figure who's trying to protect their child from an adventure. And what are Mrs. Mountjoy's options in this case? Harry Annesley has the free run of Cheltenham. He goes to the same parties, the same dances, the same routes and events that Mrs. Mountjoy, Mama Mountjoy, takes Florence to. So apart from locking her daughter up, which she obviously can't do, her only option is to take her out of London. There is a defense to be made. It's just the defense breaks down, in my opinion, the defense breaks down completely when Florence tells her mother, I never loved my cousin, and I do love this man. I was never going to marry my cousin. A mother who doesn't hear that, I think, loses a great deal of sympathy. But who knows? Who knows? We're on our way to Brussels now. So we'll wrap this up, and we'll be back next time. Thank you, BookTube.